It began with a cruel laugh inside a private hangar, a laugh that would set off a chain of events no one in the room could ever forget. A wealthy man, proud of his power and privilege, thought it would be funny to mock the woman sweeping near the door. To him, she was invisible, just another cleaner, just another life he could step on. But what he didn't know was that behind her quiet eyes, behind the uniform and the mop, lived a secret that could bring his entire empire crashing down. In that moment of arrogance, a challenge was thrown, one that was meant to humiliate, to remind her of her place. Yet when she accepted, the air shifted. The room went silent, and soon the world would know her name. So the question is, what happens when the one you look down on rises higher than you ever dreamed? Maria Alvarez crept through the wide, polished floors of Hale Aerospace's private hangar in Phoenix, Arizona. To the men and women who gathered there, dressed in tailored suits and glittering jewelry, she was almost invisible. A cleaner with a mop in her hands, a woman who passed in and out of their world without leaving a trace. But to her young son, Mateo, waiting at home with his homework and his medication lined neatly by his bedside, she was everything. She was the reason he could still dream, the reason he still believed life might offer more than illness and hardship. For months, Maria had worked in this hangar, scrubbing away oil stains and polishing glass walls that looked out on multimillion-dollar jets. She knew the rhythm of the place, the way the engines would growl awake before dawn, the laughter of wealthy investors echoing in the evenings, the silence that hung in the air once everyone was gone. She never complained. Cleaning paid just enough to cover rent in their small apartment and keep Mateo's medical treatments within reach. Every extra shift, every late night with a mop in her hand, was a sacrifice she made willingly. The hangar itself was a symbol of power. Owned by Richard Hale, the CEO of Hale Aerospace, it stood like a monument to wealth. Sleek glass walls reflected the Arizona sun, and on the polished floor sat the jewel of his empire. A private jet worth millions, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To Richard, that jet was more than a machine. It was proof of his success, a status symbol to parade in front of clients and friends. And on that particular evening, the hangar was buzzing with celebration. Richard had invited a circle of wealthy partners and acquaintances to showcase his latest acquisition, a $15 million luxury jet. They drank champagne from crystal flutes, traded stories of investments and mergers, and laughed with the easy confidence of people who had never wondered where their next meal might come from. Their voices filled the lounge, but Maria kept her eyes on the floor, pushing her mop along with steady strokes, trying not to draw attention. Yet attention found her. Richard, sharp-eyed and restless from his own need to entertain, noticed the quiet woman near the entrance. To him, she wasn't just a cleaner. She was an opportunity to flex his arrogance, to show his friends that power meant having the freedom to turn another person into the punchline of a joke. He smirked as he leaned against the leather sofa, swirling the champagne in his glass. For Maria, it was just another night on the job. She had learned long ago to endure glances that cut her down, words that reminded her she didn't belong in the glittering spaces of wealth. She carried herself with quiet dignity, even when people treated her as if she were invisible. But something about Richard's gaze made her pause. It wasn't curiosity, it was mockery. She thought briefly of Mateo, of the way his small hands gripped hers when the doctors adjusted his medication. He was her anchor, her reason for showing up, her reason for swallowing pride when pride could not pay the bills. But on this night, the air felt different. A storm was brewing. Around her, the wealthy guests were lost in laughter and indulgence, unaware of how quickly things could change. But Maria felt it. A subtle shift, as if the room itself was waiting for the moment when her life would no longer be defined by the mop in her hand or the whispers behind her back. Richard's words came like a spark in dry grass. Loud, cruel, designed to draw every eye toward her. It was not the first time someone had tried to remind her of her place. Yet this time something inside Maria stirred. She stood a little straighter, her shoulders pulling back. The humiliation meant for her was about to unravel into something far greater than Richard Hale could ever imagine. Because what he, and everyone else in that room, didn't know was that Maria's past was not ordinary. Beneath her quiet exterior lived a history of discipline, skill, and courage that had been forged in skies thousands of feet above the ground. A past that no amount of arrogance could erase. In just moments, the balance of power in that hangar would shift. The millionaire who thought he controlled the room was about to face a truth that money could not silence. And Maria Alvarez, the cleaner everyone overlooked, was about to remind the world who she really was. The laughter in the hangar rose like a cruel tide, and Richard Hale's smirk cut sharper than glass. His voice boomed through the lounge, loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't a private jab, it was a public spectacle. He pointed at the jet gleaming behind him and at Maria with her mop, daring her with words that were meant to humiliate. To his friends, it was comedy. To Maria, it was a trap wrapped in arrogance. The terms were brutal. Fly the jet, prove yourself, or be fired on the spot. Richard's tone left no room for kindness, only the promise of humiliation. Guests roared with laughter, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others raising glasses in amusement. To them, it was entertainment, a joke at the expense of a woman whose uniform marked her as less. Maria's heart pounded, but her face stayed calm. Years of swallowing insults had taught her composure. Yet this was different. This was no careless comment. It was a direct attack, one that risked the only livelihood she had. She thought of Mateo. She thought of the medical bills stacked on the kitchen counter. And in that split second, she made her choice. She accepted. The hangar went silent. The air seemed to freeze. Laughter evaporated into an uneasy stillness. Richard hadn't expected her to say yes. Neither had anyone else. His smirk faltered for a moment, but arrogance pushed him to double down. If she failed, he reminded her, she would lose everything. Maria walked toward the jet. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floor, and with every step, the room's confidence cracked. A mechanic in the corner, David Chun, watched with growing unease. He had spent decades in the Air Force before turning to civilian work, and something in Maria's movements unsettled him. They were not the steps of a nervous amateur. They were steady, controlled, precise. Inside the cockpit, Maria's hands moved with practiced ease. Switch by switch, dial by dial, she ran through a pre-flight checklist that only a trained pilot would know. David's eyes widened. He recognized every movement. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. This was an experience. His voice caught in his throat, but he said nothing. He wanted to see how far this would go. Through the headset, Maria's voice cut clear and commanding. Phoenix Tower, Alpha Tango 724 requesting clearance to Denver. The hangar guests stared, stunned, as the radio crackled back. Cleared for takeoff, Captain. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Captain. The cleaner was no cleaner at all. Maria guided the jet onto the runway, her posture transforming in an instant. Gone was the woman in the faded uniform, head bowed in silence. In her place was an officer, a pilot, a leader. As the engines roared to life, the ground trembled. Guests pressed to the glass, recording on their phones, mouths open in disbelief. Richard's laughter had died completely. His face drained of color as the jet surged forward, lifting into the Arizona sky. In the hangar, whispers grew louder, then turned into frantic searches on phones and tablets. Angela Park, an aerospace engineer among the guests, dug quickly into public records. What she uncovered left her breathless. Major Maria Alvarez, decorated U.S. Air Force pilot, veteran of combat missions, honored with medals of valor. The revelation spread like wildfire through the hangar. The cleaner Richard mocked was a war hero. The arrogance that had fueled his challenge was unraveling in real time. Every guest now looked at Richard differently. not as a man of power, but as a fool who had tried to degrade someone far greater than himself. Above, Maria flew the jet with flawless precision. She didn't just take it airborne. She danced with it in the sky. Sharp banking maneuvers, steady climbs, perfect control, the kind of flying that only years of training could produce. Inside the hangar, phones captured every second, and hashtags began to appear online. Hashtag respect Captain Alvarez. Hashtag hail humiliated. The story was already slipping out of Richard's control. Minutes passed, but each one felt like a lifetime. Richard paced, gripping his glass so tightly it nearly shattered. His friends avoided his gaze, their laughter long gone. They were watching the slow collapse of his authority. Maria had turned the stage he built for her humiliation into the theater of his downfall. Then came the descent. The jet lined up with the runway, gliding down with textbook precision. Maria guided it gently to the ground, wheels kissing the asphalt with grace. When the engines quieted, the silence in the hangar roared louder than any laughter could. The door opened. Maria stepped out, not as a janitor, but as a soldier, a pilot, a mother who had just rewritten her story before their very eyes. Mechanics saluted. Veterans among the staff stood straighter. The guests, once so eager to laugh, could not meet her gaze. And Richard, red-faced, silent, looked like a man who had been stripped of every ounce of power. But this was only the beginning. The true storm was still ahead. Contracts, investors, and the court of public opinion were about to deliver their verdict. Richard Hale thought he had mocked a cleaner. Instead, he had awakened a legacy. And Maria Alvarez had just begun to reclaim her wings. The night Maria landed that jet should have been the end of it. Proof enough that she was not the woman Richard Hale painted her to be. Proof enough that skill and dignity live far beyond uniforms or paychecks. But humiliation, when it comes to men like Richard, does not fade quietly. It festers. The very next morning, videos of Maria's flawless flight flooded the internet. Millions watched in awe as the cleaner became the captain. Hashtag respect Captain Alvarez climbed the trending charts, carried by veterans, aviation enthusiasts, and ordinary people inspired by her courage. News anchors repeated her name, while analysts dissected her maneuvers like a live sporting event. And yet, not all the attention was kind. Richard's allies in business whispered behind closed doors. Some investors dismissed Maria as a stunt, suggesting she must have cheated. Others questioned why a decorated pilot was reduced to cleaning floors. Was she really competent, or was her story too good to be true? The same prejudice that had followed her for years resurfaced in sharper, more public ways. Richard himself fueled the fire. Humiliated and desperate, he pushed a narrative that Maria had violated security protocols, endangering millions of dollars worth of equipment. His lawyers began drafting accusations. His press team fed stories to sympathetic outlets, framing Maria not as a hero, but as a reckless former soldier seeking attention. For Maria, the backlash cut deep. At home, she held Mateo's hand as the television flickered with her name. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "Are they going to take you away?" he asked softly. She didn't have an answer. Days turned into a battle she hadn't chosen. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, but also threats. Some praised her as a warrior. Others sneered at her heritage, calling her an immigrant who didn't belong in the skies. Headlines debated her worth like she was a headline herself, not a mother fighting to provide for her son. And then came the breaking point. Hale Aerospace announced that Maria was terminated for gross misconduct. No severance, no protections, no apology. Richard stood before cameras, his voice dripping with cold authority, declaring that a cleaner pretending to be a pilot had violated his trust. The hangar incident, he claimed, was an embarrassment to his company and his investors. Maria sat in her small apartment, the news replaying on screen. Every word was a knife. She had risked everything, not only to defend her dignity but to survive. and in return she was branded a liar. But Richard's cruelty didn't stop there. Within the week, veterans groups uncovered how his team had lobbied to erase her record of service from official company archives, downplaying her years in uniform. Her medals, her combat flights, her sacrifices, all painted as exaggerations. To strip her of her past was to strip her of her identity. Maria broke down that night. In the silence of her living room, she pressed her palms against her face, tears soaking through her fingers. She thought of the long hours spent away from Matteo, of every floor scrubbed, every insult endured, every quiet night of exhaustion. Was it all for nothing? And yet, beneath the crushing weight of despair, something stronger flickered. A memory. The cockpit lights of a C-17 transport were glowing in the dark skies of Afghanistan. The steady voice of her squadron leader, reminding her of the oath she swore. The hands of her fellow pilots, clasped in solidarity after missions that tested their very souls. She had been a soldier. She had carried lives in her hands at 30,000 feet. She had worn the flag on her shoulder, not for glory, but for duty. That truth could not be erased. Not by Richard Hale, not by a boardroom, not by the voices of prejudice. Maria rose from the couch, her tears drying into resolve. She was not done. She could not be done. For Matteo, for every woman told she didn't belong, for every veteran dismissed once the uniform came off. And outside her apartment walls, the tide was already turning. Veterans across the country began rallying in her defense. Mechanics who had seen her fly that night spoke out publicly. Angela Park released the documents proving her service record. And slowly the narrative shifted. But Richard Hale was not finished either. Behind his mansion gates and corporate boardrooms, he prepared his final strike. He thought he could bury Maria beneath paperwork and power, silence her with the weight of his fortune. He had no idea that his empire was already cracking beneath his feet. The stage was set for the final blow. Because Maria Alvarez, the woman he tried to humiliate, was no longer standing alone. She was about to rise higher than even she imagined, and Richard Hale was about to fall farther than he ever dreamed. When the storm finally broke, it did not fall on Maria. It fell on Richard Hale. In the weeks after her termination, Hale Aerospace began to unravel. Major contracts, some worth millions, were abruptly canceled as veterans groups and civic organizations called for boycotts. Videos of Maria's flawless flight were replayed on national news, while clips of Richard's mocking challenge circulated alongside headlines that branded him a symbol of arrogance and prejudice. Investors who once filled his boardroom now fled, unwilling to be tied to a scandal that grew louder by the day. The final blow came when the company's board of directors held an emergency vote. With Hale Aerospace's stock plunging, they stripped Richard of his title and forced him out. The man who once laughed with champagne in his hand now watched his empire collapse from the shadows. His name became a cautionary tale in classrooms and business schools, a reminder of how quickly power can crumble when built on disrespect. For Maria, the world had shifted in ways she never expected. Where she had once mopped floors, she was now seated in conference rooms, invited to speak about resilience and dignity. Skyward Aeronautics, a rival company, offered her the role of Director of Special Operations. The offer wasn't just about salary or benefits, it was about recognition. They saw her not as a cleaner, not as a scandal, but as the pilot and leader she had always been. With the position came health coverage for Matteo and an education fund to secure his future. Maria accepted. When she walked into Skyward's headquarters for the first time, her reflection in the glass walls told a story no one could deny. She had endured the humiliation of racism, the weight of prejudice, and the cruelty of being reduced to a stereotype. And yet, she had risen, higher than the ceilings others tried to impose on her. Her first press conference was broadcast across the country. Cameras flashed as Maria stood before a crowd, steady and unshaken. For 2 years, I mopped floors to provide for my son, she said. That work was honest, and I will never be ashamed of it. But let this be clear. Dignity does not come from wealth, or race, or job title. It comes from character, from courage, and from competence. Her words struck a chord. Across living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces, people saw themselves in her story. The overlooked worker, the veteran dismissed after service, the mother carrying more than her share of the weight. For them, Maria became more than a headline. She became proof that injustice can be challenged, that voices silenced for too long can still rise. The impact stretched further than her personal victory. Skyward Aeronautics launched new initiatives under Maria's leadership, programs to hire veterans, scholarships for women in aviation, and outreach to underrepresented communities. The hangar that once echoed with cruel laughter now stood as a reminder of how quickly prejudice can backfire. And for Mateo, the boy who once asked if they might take her away, life began to change too. He no longer introduced his mother as a cleaner. He introduced her with pride. My mom's a pilot. My mom's a director. My mom's a fighter. His classmates listened in awe, and for the first time, Mateo felt the weight of respect not borrowed from others, but earned through his mother's courage. Richard Hale, meanwhile, sold his estate and retreated into quiet consulting work. His name never returned to the heights it once occupied. And maybe, in some corner of his mind, he replayed that night in the hangar, the moment a woman he thought beneath him rose above everyone watching. But this story is not just about Richard Hale. It's not even just about Maria Alvarez. It is about the millions of people who know what it feels like to be dismissed, mocked, or reduced to something less because of race, gender, or class. It's about the quiet workers who carry invisible burdens, the veterans who return to civilian life only to be forgotten, the mothers who fight battles no one sees. Maria's story asks us a question that lingers long after the headlines fade. How many more voices have been silenced before we ever hear their truth? And so, the next time you pass someone mopping a floor, sweeping a hallway, or doing the work others ignore, ask yourself, do you see them, or do you look through them? Because behind those quiet faces may live stories of courage, sacrifice, and greatness we cannot begin to imagine. Maria Alvarez was mocked for being just a cleaner. She left the world remembering her as a pilot, a leader, and a symbol of dignity. So I leave you with this: if one act of arrogance can expose the truth of a hero, how many heroes are we still walking past every single day? What did you think of Maria's story? Was Richard's downfall deserved? Or do you believe people like him ever truly learn from their mistakes? Maria's journey from cleaner to pilot and leader is proof that dignity and courage can't be erased by prejudice. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And if this story moved you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one.